Welcome to episode 8 in our video series about the Founding Fathers of the United States of America. Now, if you've seen some of the prior videos in the series, you know that this video series is not some boring old recitation of facts, but instead, we are having some fun here. So we are considering the context at the time. So we are understanding the situations that confronted our founding fathers. And we're learning what our founding fathers believed and what our founding fathers did. And as a result of this, we are really getting to know who our founding fathers were as people, as individuals. And we're also gaining a wonderful perspective into the fascinating story about the founding of this nation. So we are coming to you from none other than Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where the government was essentially founded. And in the prior videos, we established our big board. And the big board is what we are using to keep track of the 5 central founding fathers that we are focusing on in this video series. So you can see our 5 founding fathers here on the big board, and you can see the little number 1 under George Washington. And that number 1 signifies that George Washington was the first president of the United States. So we also explained the other things going on this big board, like we explained the blue line between Washington and Hamilton, signifying how close these two guys were and that they shared the same vision of government. We also explained the blue arrow at the bottom of the big board. And that signifies how James Madison had the stunning reversal of when he switched political parties. And we also explained the red curved line in the center of the big board and how that represents the 2 opposing political parties that were in conflict. So on the one end of the red line, you've got Hamilton and his Federalist Party that believed in a strong centralized federal government. And on the other end of the red line, you have Jefferson and his Democratic Republican Party that was opposed to this and was opposed to a strong central federal government. So that's what we learned in the prior videos. And then in the past video, episode number 7, we saw how George Washington was the first president of the United States, but at the end of episode number 7, George Washington was stepping down as the first president of the United States. This was a huge issue facing the country. Could anybody else do it? Right? This is a big question. So what happens next? Well, let's jump right into episode 8. With George Washington not running for president, the question becomes, who's going to be the next president? What is going to happen here? So, with these 2 political parties that have emerged, each political party decides to produce its own candidate and run its own candidate for the presidency. So, as a result, this becomes the first contested presidential election in American history. Right? The first 2 presidential elections they're all unified behind George Washington. Right? Everybody wanted George Washington. So there was no contest. There was no opposition candidate. Candidates were not running against each other. Everybody wanted George Washington. But now here, in 1796, with George Washington stepping down, you've got these 2 political parties. They're going to produce their own candidates, and those candidates are going to run against each other. So this is the first contested presidential election in America. So who are the 2 candidates? So the Federalist Party nominates none other than John Adams. Now this is actually a great choice because remember, John Adams was the vice president to George Washington through these 2 terms. right? So George Washington is this, great, super popular president. Everybody loves him and respects him and all that. So now that George Washington steps down, there's going to be concern. Oh my gosh, who's going to be the next president? So what the Federalists are saying, well, the next logical choice is, let's just make the vice president George Washington's own vice president. Let's have him become president because he was George Washington's right-hand man, right? So this makes eminent sense. It's like it's just going to be a smooth continuation of George Washington's presidency. So John Adams is a logical choice and a very strong choice here for the Federalist Party. So who do the Democratic Republicans nominate as their candidate? Well, they nominate none other than their fearless leader, Thomas Jefferson. So you've got John Adams running against Thomas Jefferson, right? So John Adams was George Washington's vice president. Thomas Jefferson was George Washington's former Secretary of State. And now these two guys are running against each other to succeed George Washington. Right? So that's pretty interesting. It is also a fascinating story from a personal perspective. Because remember, these two guys were great friends. Right? 20 years ago in 1776, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson became great friends. And in fact, it was Adams who arranged for Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. And Adams was actually helping Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence, right? So these guys had, had great respect for each other, great admiration, and they were great friends. Now skip ahead 20 years later, 1796, and they are running against each other for president and opposing each other as the head of their two parties, right? So this is pretty amazing. So that's Adams and Jefferson here running against each other. So what about Hamilton? Now, what's Hamilton up to here? Well, Hamilton is no longer in government. He's out practicing law so he can try to raise some money for himself. But, of course, Hamilton cannot resist getting involved in this, right? After all, this is the next president after George Washington. So Hamilton is all over this. Okay, so who does Hamilton want? Well, turns out Hamilton, of course, does not want Thomas Jefferson, right? I mean, Hamilton and Jefferson, they were the two opposing parties, right? Jefferson is almost Hamilton's arch nemesis, right? Completely different vision. So of course, Hamilton does not want Jefferson. So you would think that Hamilton would be supporting John Adams, right? Because this is the candidate of the Federalist Party. And this is Hamilton's very own Federalist Party, right? So you'd think he'd be getting behind the party and supporting John Adams. But in fact, Hamilton does not do this. Hamilton doesn't want John Adams either. And the reason Hamilton doesn't want John Adams is because Hamilton feels that Adams is not strong enough as a Federalist. Even though Adams is a Federalist and he's in this Federalist Party, Hamilton feels that Adams is not strong enough of a Federalist. Okay, so Hamilton does not want Adams. Okay, so where does that leave Hamilton? What's the story here? Well, Hamilton wants this other guy, this sort of third guy here. And he wants this third guy to become president. So how can this be? If the two main candidates are already selected for the parties, how can it be that this third person could become president? Well, this goes to Hamilton's little penchant for scheming and plotting and planning. Okay, so this was an aspect to Hamilton. So this was his darker side, right? All these founding fathers have, good sides to them and sides that we admire, but they also have sides to them that are not so good and that are, dark. And this is Hamilton's darker side. So he was a schemer and a manipulator, and he was shrewd and devious. So Hamilton is plotting and planning here as to how he can try to have this third guy who he wants leapfrog these other two candidates to become president. Now, how in the world could Hamilton pull this off? So this goes to Hamilton's scheme. So you have to remember now, back at the time, the way the presidential elections were conducted is there were no tickets. There wasn't a ticket. So there wasn't a president and a vice president running together. Okay, that's not how it was done. The way it was done is that all the candidates were running for president. Nobody was running for vice president. All were running for president. And the way it worked is that the candidate who received the most votes would become president, and the candidate who received the second most votes would become vice president. That's how the vice president was selected. And the thinking was you get the best guy and the number two guy, the two best guys. Most votes and the second most votes, president and vice president. So that is one aspect here of the elections, back then. So this kind of presented a problem for the political parties as they emerged, because if you're a political party, you'd think, well, wait a minute, we want a president from our party, but we also want a vice president from our party. So how do you do that? If you want the president and the vice president to be both in your party, how do you do that? Because there's nobody's running for vice president, they're all running for president. So it became a little tricky here for these political parties. So what they had to do was they had to sort of try to play a game of where they would calculate that they would have most of their party vote for the president, the guy they wanted to be president, but then some of their party vote for the guy they wanted to be vice president. It was sort of a little game here. So almost like you get 60% of your party to vote for the person you want as president, and I'm just making these numbers up, 40% of your party to vote for the guy that you want to be vice president, and that's how you ensure who will be president and vice president. So that's what these political parties were the game they were sort of playing here. So Hamilton recognizes the weakness in this system here and how there was, how it didn't quite make sense, and he seeks to exploit this. Okay, so here's Hamilton's little scheme here. So what Hamilton does is he recognizes that most of the people are going to vote for Adams in the North. So most of the people in the North are going to vote for Adams because Adams, he's from the North. He's from Massachusetts, and Adams favors all these programs of the Federalist Party that were, favoring the industry and manufacturing and finance, all these businesses in the North, right? But the people in the South are going to favor Jefferson, because Jefferson was from the South. He's from Virginia, and Jefferson favored all, the agriculture in the South. And Jefferson was opposed to these big programs in the North that were favoring the Northern businesses. So Hamilton realizes that the North is going to vote for Adams and the South is going to vote for Jefferson. As a result, this is going to split the vote. It's going to split the vote in the country. North to Adams, South to Jefferson. So Hamilton sees this opportunity here. So what he does is Hamilton goes out to his friends in the North, and Hamilton says, I'm behind John Adams for president. Yes, John Adams. Now, this was a lie. Okay, Hamilton did not want John Adams for president. Hamilton wanted this guy, his own handpicked candidate here for president. But he tells his friends in the North, I'm for John Adams. So this kind of, endears the people in the North to Hamilton's view here, and plus Hamilton's supporting his own Federalist Party. I'm for John Adams. So they said, great, yeah, that's good. So that, endears Hamilton, to them. So then Hamilton says, you know what, let's have this guy as the vice president. So let's go for John Adams as president, but let's have this guy as vice president. So as a result, the Federalists will have some of their people, good number of their people voting for this guy as vice president. So, since Hamilton wants Adams as president, this guy's vice president, okay, that seems reasonable. So then Hamilton goes to his friends in the South, and Hamilton says, I'm for Thomas Jefferson for president. Now this, again, of course, is a flat-out lie. Hamilton's not for Jefferson for president. Jefferson is, his nemesis. Of course he doesn't want Jefferson as president. But that's what he tells his friends in the South. I want Jefferson for president. He's the best guy for the job. So this endears, Hamilton to the people in the South. Okay, that makes sense because we want Jefferson too. And then Hamilton says to his friends in the South, and let's go for this guy as vice president for Jefferson. Now you begin to see the scheme here of Hamilton. What Hamilton is doing here is he knows the vote's going to be split between Adams and Jefferson, North and South, but if he can convince both North and South to vote for this guy, as the vice president in mind, then this guy, which is who Hamilton really wants as president, this guy's going to get the votes of both North and South. And as a result of getting both North and South, this guy will end up getting more votes than either Adams or Jefferson. And as a result, this guy, if he gets more votes, he's going to become president. Not just vice president, he's going to become president because he's the candidate who gets the most votes. So this is Hamilton's scheme for how he's going to have his own hand-picked candidate here leapfrog Adams and Jefferson to become the next president. So this is what Hamilton is up to. You can see he is very devious. He's very clever. He's very smart, but he's also manipulative here. So, as it turns out, Hamilton's little scheme here is discovered. Okay, so people get a sense of what he's doing, and it's not surprising because he was, lying to people and telling different people different things. Right? He's telling everyone in the South that he wants Jefferson. He's telling everybody in the North that he wants Adams. People are going to talk and realize that something's going on. So Hamilton's plot here gets discovered. Now, the people who are the most upset with Hamilton and that he was doing this little plot are the Federalists. Right? This is his own party, right? And they had nominated John Adams here. And now, if Hamilton were really behind the Federalists, his own party, Hamilton should be supporting John Adams and lending his credibility to get John Adams elected so the Federalists can, continue in office here. But Hamilton doesn't do this. Hamilton seeks to undermine his own party, the Federalists, and seeks to undermine John Adams. So the other person who was extremely upset with Hamilton was John Adams, right? Because Hamilton was undermining John Adams' candidacy here, right? So Adams was, furious at Hamilton for this, and rightly so. So Hamilton has upset his own party here. So what does his own party do? What do the Federalists do? Well, they certainly don't vote for this guy who Hamilton wants, and instead what they do is they concentrate their votes for John Adams. So what happens in the election? Well, so the election is held, the votes are counted, and the person who received the most votes was John Adams. So John Adams becomes the next president of the United States. So the guy who receives the second most votes was Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson becomes vice president. So vice president under John Adams. So what happened to Hamilton's candidate that, he was trying to manipulate him getting in office? Well, Hamilton's candidate came in third place. So as third place, you don't get anything. You're out. You got nothing because the first place goes to the president, second place goes to vice president, and everybody else is out. So Hamilton's candidate is out. Adams is president. Jefferson is vice president. And Hamilton's scheme does not work. So poetic justice there, right? It's fairness is realized in the end. So it has a happy ending there. So that's a good thing that Hamilton's scheme here was not successful. But what happened was this has produced some very odd results, right? You've got some strange bedfellows here because the situation that you have is you've got Adams as the president for the Federalists, but Adams's vice president, Thomas Jefferson, is from the opposing political party. Right? Jefferson is from the Democratic Republicans. So this is a weird situation. This is not what you would want, right? What you want is your president and your vice president to be in harmony and working together. But if they're from opposing political parties, they're going to be in conflict. They're going to be fighting with each other. This is not a good situation. So imagine today if, the situation would be like if a Democrat won the presidency and a Republican were the vice president. You'd have the two parties fighting against each other and undermine each other. This is not what you want. But nonetheless, this is the situation that resulted here in this election. So you might think, well, how could this happen? How could this possibly happen? And the reason that it happened is because when the Founding Fathers designed this system, of, nobody running for vice president. Everybody would just run for president. The number one guy becomes president, and the number two guy becomes vice president. There were no political parties back then, and the Founding Fathers were envisioning that there would be no political parties. But of course, once the two political parties emerged, that's when this became a problem, where you could end up with a result with the president from one political party and the vice president from the opposing political party, which is not a good thing. So they ended up changing that system. And this is why today, in elections today, you have a ticket, meaning that you vote for, the president and the president's vice president. They're together on a ticket. You vote for them together. And that's because of this little problem here that came to light, largely as a result of this election. But that is the situation that you had in this election here of 1796. John Adams becomes the second president of the United States. So let's put a little 2 here under John Adams' name to signify that he's the second president of the United States, just like we have a little 1 here under George Washington's name, because George Washington was the first president of the United States. So John Adams becomes president, and Thomas Jefferson becomes the vice president under John Adams. So previously, remember, we had John Adams was the vice president to George Washington. So previously it was George Washington as president and John Adams as vice president. And now with this election, we have John Adams as president and Thomas Jefferson as vice president. So the situation with these two guys, though, is very odd because they are from opposing political parties. You've got John Adams for the Federalists as president, but Thomas Jefferson from the completely opposite political party, the Democratic Republicans, as vice president. So you've got the president and vice president from completely different parties. That is an unusual situation. And now remember, the story here between these two men personally is fascinating. In that 20 years ago, these guys were great friends, right? It was Adams who arranged for Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. But now, 20 years later, they ran against each other for president. Adams won, Jefferson lost, but they're now president and vice president, even though they're from opposing parties. So you've got a lot of odd things going on here. Now, Hamilton is not happy with John Adams. Hamilton is not happy that Adams turned out to be the president for the Federalist. Now, it's certainly much better than Jefferson being president, because Jefferson was from a completely different political party. But nonetheless, Hamilton felt that Adams was not a strong enough Federalist. And indeed, he was right. So Adams believed in some of the things that Hamilton wanted to do and these strong Federalists wanted to do, but not everything that Hamilton wanted to do. So John Adams, he was a Federalist, he was the president from the Federalist Party, but he was sort of in the middle here. And this put him in a somewhat precarious position politically, because John Adams was certainly not a member of Jefferson's party, so Jefferson was in opposition. So John Adams had opposition from Jefferson and his party, but John Adams did not have the full support from Hamilton and the more hardliners from the Federalist Party with Hamilton. So as a result, John Adams is kind of out here in no man's land politically. John Adams had some political problems with his presidency right from the very start. And one of them was his vice president, right? Thomas Jefferson was from the opposing political party. I mean, imagine, this perspective from John Adams. Talk about the bad luck. I mean, he'd finally, become president of the United States, and lo and behold, his vice president is his political enemy. I mean, it's amazing. So, and this is the only time in history where this nation has had the president from one party and the vice president from the opposing political party, right? So this is certainly a bad thing for John Adams. And Thomas Jefferson takes advantage of this. So Thomas Jefferson uses his office of the vice presidency to attack the president, to attack John Adams, right? So Jefferson, as the vice president, he has this bully pulpit, right? The press is going to cover him, all of this. So he utilizes that for his own personal political advantage, and he starts attacking John Adams. And this has a lot of effect, right? Because people in the nation are saying, wow, if the vice president thinks that the president is doing bad things, wow, maybe the president is doing bad things. So this is a problem for John Adams. He just can't believe this. He can't believe that his own vice president is from the opposing political party and is attacking him. It is rather incredible. So this poses a problem for Adams because he's being attacked from the opposing political party. He's being attacked from one side, Jefferson's party, and the leader of the opposing political party happens to be his own vice president. So he's got that problem. But Adams also has the problem that he is being attacked from the other side as well. He's being attacked by Hamilton from the more extreme side of the Federalists. So this is a problem for Adams as well. So what happened was, when Adams became president, Adams left in place the cabinet from George Washington. So when George Washington was president, he had his own cabinet, senior people, and when Adams became president, Adams left that cabinet in place. Now, so why would he do this? Because what you would think, and this is what happens today, when a new president is elected, the new president comes in and gets rid of all the senior people from the former president, and the new president appoints his own people, right? So he has his own people in office and his own people around him, supporting him, they're loyal to him, all of that. So that is, the typical practice. So why didn't Adams do that? He could have done that, but he didn't. And the reason was because Adams was concerned that he wanted to make this political transition smooth, okay? Because this was, if you think about it, this was the first transition of power in the nation's history. Okay, so one president giving power to a new president. This is the first time that happened. Now, it's true that the power transferring was not a huge transfer of power. It wasn't a big difference because power was just transferring within the same political party, and it was transferring from one president to his own vice president, because Adams had been George Washington's vice president. So it's not a huge difference. Nonetheless, it was still the first transfer of power. Now, as we know from history and around the world, even to this day in countries around the world, the transfer of power is a very vulnerable moment for a nation. This is when all sorts of attacks occur. When one ruler is ending their power and transferring their power to a new ruler, this is a vulnerable time. So this is when wars start. This is when coups d'etats start. It's when people start to overthrow the government because people are like, hey, I want to get power. I want to seize power. Maybe the old guy's going to try to hang on to power, and all sorts of bad stuff happens at the moment of the transition of power. So Adams is certainly aware of this, and he does not want that to happen in America. He wants the transition of power to go smoothly. So this is why he keeps in place all of Washington's cabinet and the senior people. So basically what Adams is saying is, he's saying to the nation, look, this is a transfer of power. I'm the new guy. But don't worry, nothing crazy is going to happen, nothing new, nothing shocking is going to happen. This is going to go very smoothly. It's just going to be a continuation of the Washington administration. Just a continuation. I'm just going to step in and continue the program. And this is true because I'm leaving in place all these senior members. So that is why Adams does not put his own people in place. And this is actually a pretty honorable and noble act, because Adams is putting the interests of the nation ahead of his own political interests. So, that's pretty cool. But this has a problem for Adams. And the problem is Hamilton. And the reason is because, remember, Hamilton was in the Washington administration. He was the Secretary of Treasury, and he was this hugely influential guy, this enormously influential guy. So he basically had the influence of all of Washington's cabinet. They were all under the influence of Hamilton. So Hamilton is now outside of government, but Hamilton was a great influence on these people who are inside of government in the cabinet. So Hamilton was exploiting this, and he was up to his little tricks here. So Hamilton was trying to control the presidency. He was trying to control government from outside because Hamilton had this great influence over this cabinet. So what was happening is, John Adams as president, he would go to his cabinet, he'd try to get his cabinet on board with what he wanted to do and get everybody working to support Adams' position, but they weren't supporting Adams' position because they were more loyal to Hamilton. So they were doing what Hamilton wanted to do instead of doing what Adams wanted to do. So this was a problem because Hamilton was undermining Adams' presidency. Now, Adams knew this. He was a smart guy. He was no dummy. He knew this was going on, but he allowed it to go on. And the reason he allowed it to go on, again, is because he put the interests of the nation ahead of his own. So he said, I know this is a problem, but it's more important for me to communicate this message to the nation that this administration is going to be smooth and the transfer of power is not going to cause any problems. So again, a noble act here. Now, eventually Adams did start replacing people, but it wasn't until later, and it was particularly after George Washington died in 1799, Adams started replacing people and putting his own people in place. So this was going on here, and Adams had these political problems that he had to deal with here, and he's being attacked from the opposing political party on one side, and he's being attacked from his own party, from Hamilton on the Federalists. They were both Federalists, but Hamilton was nonetheless attacking John Adams. So John Adams had this sort of political precarious position here. So that was one issue that Adams was dealing with. But Adams also had substantive issues to deal with during his term as president. And one of the central issues had to do with this overarching issue of the war in Europe. Again, back to the war in Europe. So this was England at war with France. They were fighting against each other. Now, even though America was neutral in that war, did not pick sides, the war still had a huge effect on America. So, for Adams, the problem here is with France. Now, France was not particularly happy with America at this time because America had just entered into this treaty, the Jay Treaty, under George Washington, with Britain, America and Britain. So France was feeling kind of left out. Well, Adams kind of made things worse here because what Adams did is Adams decided that America would stop paying the debt that America owed to France. Okay, so America is just going to stop paying the debt. Not paying the debt that America owes to France. Why? What was the justification? Well, the justification that Adams offered was that France has a new government, and the debts were owed to the former government, not the new government. Okay, so what was happening in France was the French Revolution had been underway. So this was the peasants in France, the commoners, the ordinary people had risen up and overthrown the French monarchy, overthrown the French king and queen. And the peasants had instituted their own government, their new democratic government. Now, this whole situation in France was celebrated by Thomas Jefferson and his party, the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson thought the French Revolution was a wonderful thing, right? He thought it was freedom and liberty and people achieving their own independence. He thought that France was achieving its own independence, just like America had achieved its independence. Same thing. So Jefferson thought this was a good thing in France. But the Federalists, they favored Britain. They favored a more centralized government, more authoritarian government, this sort of thing. So the Federalists did not like what was going on in France. They did not like the French Revolution, and they characterized it more as these peasants committing these acts of violence and overthrowing a legitimate government. So the Federalists were not keen on this French Revolution here. So what Adams said was, he said, I'm going to stop paying the debt, that America owes to France. And the reason was because the debt that America owed to France, America owed this debt to the French monarchy, to that government. So when the peasants came in and overthrew the French monarchy and instituted a new government in France, well, we no longer owe the debt. We owed the debt to the old government, the French monarchy. And since the French monarchy no longer exists, well, our debt no longer exists either. Now, this argument is certainly thin at best, right? There is really not much of a justification for this argument. But nonetheless, that's what Adams does. So this, naturally, angers France even further. So France is saying to themselves, look, it looks like America is turning hostile against France and they're favoring Britain. So, we really don't have any allegiance here to America. So what does France start doing? France starts doing the same thing that England was doing to America previously, which is France starts attacking American merchant ships on the high seas. So these are American merchant ships. They're not military ships, they're merchant ships. So they're trading goods back and forth with the Caribbean and with Europe. So the French warships start attacking these American merchant ships and seizing the ships and seizing the goods and all of that. So this is the same thing that England had done. But when England did it, remember, the Federalists were in power under George Washington, and the Federalists kind of favored England. So they didn't really want to go to war with England, and they ended up working out this treaty with England. But now the Federalists, under John Adams, they don't like France. So when France is doing the exact same thing, well, now the reaction from the United States is much stronger. So now the Federalists are saying, we need to go to war with France. We can't let the French take over our ships and seize our ships. No, we need to respond militarily. We need to go to war against France and stop them. Okay, so the reaction here from the federal government is much stronger. So it's actually kind of unbelievable to think about today, but at the time, America did not have a federal navy. They had no navy, right? Because what happened was at the end of the Revolutionary War, America as a nation disbanded its federal army. And this was because Jefferson and his party was concerned about a federal army. Oh my gosh, they were terrified by a standing army, right? So they disbanded the federal army. So now there's no navy. So France is attacking American ships and America doesn't have a navy. So Adams says this is a problem again for the Federalists. They're in favor of a standing army. So Adams said this is a problem. We need to kick it into gear here, and we need to create a navy here. So Congress gets on board with this. So Congress authorizes the America to start building ships, and they begin taking existing ships and turning them into warships by putting cannons on them, that sort of thing. So America responds militarily to France. So America starts sending some warships over and starts attacking French ships. Okay, so you have this dispute going on here where France is attacking American ships, and now America is attacking French ships. And then they're battling out on the seas. So this turns into what became known as the quasi-war with France. So it was a quasi-war. It wasn't a full-blown war. That there was no fighting on the ground. It was all at sea. But also, war was never declared. So Congress never declared war against France, but instead they're kind of just battling it out on the seas here. So, but it was real. I mean, people were dying and ships were being seized and sunk and, this whole thing. So it was a real conflict. So that's why it was called the quasi-war. So as part of this, the Federalists are sort of stoking up, passions here against France. So they're saying, France is a problem here. France is attacking us. France could attack us, our nation. They could try to invade America. France is this evil country. We need to, start protecting ourselves against France. So they start sort of, inciting this idea. So one thing that John Adams does is he said, we've got to build up an army, not only a navy to attack them on the seas, but we've got to build up an army here at home in order to protect ourselves in the event that France tries to invade us. So John Adams calls back George Washington. So George Washington is in retirement on his estate in Virginia. He calls him back out of retirement to come and build a federal army and create this federal army so we can protect ourselves against attacks by France. So Washington says, okay, fine, I will serve my country. So he again comes out of retirement here to serve his country. But Washington says, I need Hamilton. Okay. So again, Hamilton, I mean, these guys have been together for a long time, right? Even in the Revolutionary War, Hamilton was Washington's, assistant. And then when Washington was president, Hamilton was the strong Secretary of the Treasury, sort of helping with Washington with things. So Hamilton had long been Washington's right-hand man. So Washington says, I need Hamilton. Now, Adams, as president, he's not wild about bringing Hamilton back into the government, because Hamilton is causing Adams all these problems already, as it is, right? Undermining his presidency. But again, Adams puts the interests of the nation ahead of his own political interests. So Adams says, okay, fine, Washington, you can have Hamilton as well. So Washington and Hamilton they both come back into the country, the government, to build up this army, this federal army. So Washington and Hamilton, the band is back together, right? So they're creating this federal army, and of course Hamilton takes over the whole thing, as his personality is wont to do. So he just takes over the whole thing. He's like running the whole operation here. So that's underway. They're building up the federal army here. So as part of this, what the Federalists are also doing, and they're concerned that there are French citizens. There are a lot of French citizens in America at the time, and the Federalists are kind of stoking passions against the French citizens. And what they're suggesting is that France might be plotting and planning here in America. So citizens in America who are from France might be plotting and planning to overthrow the American government. Okay, because hey, if you look what they did in the French Revolution, this is what they did in France, right? They were the peasants, the ordinary citizens in France started plotting and planning, and they were successful. They overthrew the French monarchy. So maybe the French are doing the same thing here in America. They're plotting and planning, and they're going to overthrow America, and then they're going to invite France, the country, to come in, invade America, and take over America. So we need to be concerned about French people here in this country, and this is a very sensitive time in this country with this war going on here with France, and France potentially going to invade America, that we also need to be concerned about people who are speaking out against the government and people who are sort of inciting action here against the government. So as a result of this, the Federalists create some laws here along these lines. And these laws were known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. So they were passed by the Federalists in Congress. It was a set of 4 bills, and they were signed by John Adams as president, Federalist president, into law. So the Federalists create these Alien and Sedition Acts. These Alien and Sedition Acts were some of the worst laws that have ever been created in American history. And in fact, today, to this very day, they are a stain on the presidency of John Adams. Okay, these Alien and Sedition laws were horrible, and they are a black mark against the presidency of John Adams. Okay, so these were terrible, terrible laws. So what were these laws about? So there are 2 things, alien and sedition. They were related, but they were separate as well. So alien, what do they mean by alien? So by alien, they did not mean aliens from outer space. What they meant was people from foreign countries. So that's what I meant by aliens, people from foreign countries. And really they were thinking about France. It didn't say France, but that's really what they were thinking about. So these laws said that for aliens, for people from foreign countries, the government could take them and throw them in jail for almost no reason. I mean, it was very thin. So like one reason was you could be thrown in jail if you were suspected of, undermining the American government, right? Another thing you could be thrown in jail for is anybody, you didn't even have to be doing any bad conduct. Anybody who was from a hostile nation, a hostile foreign nation, France, although it didn't say France, anybody who's from a hostile foreign nation could be thrown in jail. Okay, this is crazy. I mean, you didn't even have to do anything wrong and you could be thrown in jail and deported. Okay, so I mean, this is, crazy law. So that was the alien part. It was sort of against foreigners. Then the sedition part, so sedition is when people incite to overthrow a government. So the sedition part of these laws said that you could not criticize the government. So what they were concerned with was people who were, fomenting, hey, we should be against this government, because they were concerned that this might lead to, overthrowing the government. So these sedition laws, no one could criticize the government. And if you did, you could be thrown in jail. Again, crazy. This is a crazy law. I mean, this nation was founded upon freedom and freedom of speech, right? The First Amendment to the Constitution guarantees freedom of speech. Well, this Sedition Act comes along and it basically says no more criticism against the government. I mean, it was crazy, right? This is not the way that, not the principles that America was founded upon. And in fact, it is widely thought that these laws would have been struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, because they just appear on their face to be blatantly unconstitutional. Now, these laws never actually made it to the Supreme Court because they were very unpopular. Political winds changed, and the government stopped enforcing these laws. So it was never necessary to bring them to the Supreme Court. But it's widely thought, today, and even at the time, that of course these laws were unconstitutional, and of course they would have been struck down. But nonetheless, they passed into laws, and they were being enforced. Now, Thomas Jefferson felt, and his party, they felt that these laws were not about France. France was just a cover. Right? It was just an excuse. What these laws were really about was suppressing the political opposition. It was the Federalists suppressing Jefferson's party. That's what these laws were really about. So this is what Jefferson and his party, the Democratic Republicans, were saying. So how is this happening? So what they're saying was the reason the Federalists enacted laws against aliens is because most immigrants were in favor of Jefferson's party. Okay, they liked the Democratic Republicans. It's sort of similar to today, where most immigrants favor the Democratic Party over the Republican Party. Well, back then it was very similar. Most immigrants favored Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republican Party. So with these the Alien Acts, what the Federalists could do is they could take immigrants who were politically active, who were politically, trying to gain support and develop support for Jefferson's party. They could take them, throw them in jail, and even deport them. Okay, so that's why they enacted the alien laws here. And the sedition laws, I mean, this is, they were just trying to suppress criticism of their own government. That's what these sedition laws were about, that's basically what was happening. So when Adams started enforcing these laws were not being enforced against Federalists. They were being enforced against Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republican Party. So they started harassing newspapers and all that, but only the newspapers that were Democratic Republican newspapers. Now, part of this is because the Federalists weren't really criticizing their own government, right? Because it was their own government. Their own party was in power. So there weren't a lot of Federalists who were going around criticizing the government. The people who were criticizing the government was the political opposition, Jefferson's party. So they were the ones who were suffering at these laws were being enforced against Jefferson's party. And sure enough, they were enforcing these laws. So you had newspaper writers, journalists. So they would write critiques of the Adams administration, and they would end up in jail. Right now, some of these newspaper articles were salacious. They were like tabloids, and they were pretty rough and tumble. Like this. So they would refer to Adams as like a tyrant and an oppressor and a monarch. Actually, this was a common theme back at the time, is the political opposition would often refer to Adams as a monarch, because he was kind of like that. He believed in the strong federal government. He was appointing his sons to political positions. So it was kind of like he was favoring his own monarchical family kind of thing. And Democratic Republicans viewed the Federalist Party as sort of like a monarchy, in that it was, creating this strong central government. So they would often refer to and mock Adams as like the king, the monarch. So journalists who were writing that, who were in the Democratic Republican Party, they were thrown in jail. Newspaper editors thrown in jail. There was even a congressman who was, critical of the Adams administration. He was thrown in jail. Okay, I mean, it's amazing. It is astonishing to think that this was going on in America, right? America's freedom of speech. It's this country that was based upon this. But this was going on with these Alien and Sedition Acts. It was shocking. So Jefferson was certainly correct to criticize these laws. He was saying they're unconstitutional. These laws are outrageous, and they certainly were. Jefferson and his party was also saying, they were saying, look, this is what we warned you about. This is the danger of creating a central federal government. When you give power to a federal government, a centralized federal government, they will turn around and abuse that power. They will become like the King of England, like the monarchy. This is what we've been warning about for years, right? And this goes back to the whole debate at the Constitutional Convention as to whether to create a strong centralized government or not. And this has been the criticism from Jefferson and these states' rights people. They're saying, we told you so. We told you so. If you enable a federal government to have power, they will turn around, abuse that power, and they will start to oppress the people. And that's what they're doing under these Alien and Sedition Acts. They are suppressing the political operation, or the political opposition. This is exactly what's going on. This is why you can't have a strong federal government. So that was their argument from the states' rights folks, from Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, right? So pretty funny and pretty incredible also. So they were certainly right that these laws were outrageous. The Alien and Sedition Acts were outrageous and clearly, unconstitutional, and they were, certainly bad things. So that was all, justified. But Jefferson and Madison actually took their opposition a step further, and they started having a reaction to these Alien and Sedition Acts. And many today regard this as an overreaction. It was a too extreme overreaction to these terrible laws. As terrible as these laws were, and they were terrible, the reaction from Jefferson and Madison was even worse. It was an overreaction. So what their reaction was they started saying, Jefferson and Madison and his party started saying that the states had the right to nullify these Alien and Sedition Acts, meaning that the states did not have to enforce them in their own state, okay, if they didn't want to. Okay, now what this means, this is the idea of nullification, which means state nullification. And what this means is that a state could nullify a federal law. Okay, so if a federal law is passed by Congress, like the Constitution says, and signed by the president, if a state doesn't like that law, the state can just nullify it and refuse to enforce it. Now, this is an extreme position, right? It is an extreme position. It is radical. And in fact, it undermines the entire idea of the federal government, right? I mean, if a state can just nullify a federal law, then what good are federal laws, right? We're right back to where we were before under the Articles of Confederation, right? Where states could do whatever they want. This was the whole problem. This is why people came together to create the Constitution, because the Articles of Confederation were a big mess. It wasn't working when states could do whatever they want. So it is shocking that now Jefferson and Madison are arguing for this nullification, that states could nullify this. And in fact, for Madison, it's funny because this again highlights the extreme reversal that Madison had. Because when Madison, back at the time of the Constitutional Convention, Madison is the father of the Constitution. He drafted much of the Constitution. One of the things he was advocating for back then was that the federal government should have the right to veto any law from any state. Okay? Now, that did not make it into the Constitution, but that's how strongly Madison felt back then that the federal government should be supreme over the states. Well, now, skip ahead to today, and Madison is arguing for state nullification, which is the exact opposite. He's saying that states should be supreme over the federal government because states should be able to nullify any federal law. I mean, it is completely upside down. He's exactly reversed himself completely. It's amazing, pretty funny. So this idea of nullification is radical and it is extreme. And in fact, a number of states at the time recognized this, that it was radical and extreme. So Jefferson actually himself personally, he even went a step further, that he even started to advocate for secession, that the states had the right to secede from the Union, meaning that a state could leave the United States. So if a state did not like a federal law, a state could say, like let's say Virginia, the state of Virginia, Jefferson's own home state, right? A state could say, wow, I don't like that federal law. So not only am I going to nullify it, not going to honor it here in my state. But I, the state of Virginia, I am going to secede. I am going to pull away from the United States. I, Virginia, am no longer part of the United States. I am now my own sovereign nation of Virginia. So that's what Jefferson was saying. He's saying if the federal government enacts a bad law, a state could then secede from the Union, secede from the United States. Now, Madison came to Jefferson and said, Jefferson, dude, because Madison, his friend and colleague, they're from the same party. So Madison came to Jefferson and said, Jefferson, you can't take that position. That position is too extreme. It is too radical, and it results in the undermining of the entire government. You have to back away from that position. So Madison actually convinces Jefferson to back away from that position of secession. But nonetheless, both Jefferson and Madison, are favoring this idea of nullification. So it's less severe than secession, but it's still pretty severe. So nullification just means a state could nullify one law, right? The state is still part of the Union, but they could just say, we don't like that law, we're not going to enforce it. Whereas secession means the state could also leave the Union. So Jefferson backs away from secession, but still Jefferson and Madison are advocating for this, nullification, that states have the rights to nullify federal law. Now, a number of states just disagreed with this. A number of states came out and said, Jefferson, Madison, guys, you guys are going too far with this nullification argument. We do not believe that. And in fact, it will undermine the entire federal system. So what they said is, look, this whole idea of the Constitution, it already has checks and balances built into it. So there's already ways to solve the problem of bad laws. And we're going to have bad laws throughout our time, right? Throughout our system, of course, bad laws are going to come up. But we've thought about that, and we've built in checks and balances. So for example, like this law, the Alien and Sedition Acts, these are bad laws, fine. But what you should do is you should challenge them and seek to have them declared as unconstitutional. Take them to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will strike them down as unconstitutional, and then everything will be fine. And you're still operating under this government that we created. So that's one thing that you can do. That's one check and balance that exists in our system. Another thing you could do is, if these laws are so bad, the people are not going to like these laws, so the people can vote for new representatives to Congress. So enact new politicians. Those politicians can then strike down the law and create new laws. So that's another way of handling it, but you're handling it within the system that we designed. But you guys, your nullification argument, that destroys the system. That undermines the system. That takes us right back to the Articles of Confederation. We can't have that. That's too radical. So a number of these states were taking that position against Jefferson and Madison. So, I mean, it is true that this argument of nullification is incredible, right? So, but nonetheless, it did not take hold then. So it wasn't like all the states, got behind this article of nullification. A number of them said, no, that's too radical. But nonetheless, even though it didn't succeed then, it still has been a part of the nation's history all the way to the present day. So it has risen its head from time to time throughout the nation's history. And these examples have been incredible. So like one example was 1830. So this was like 30 years later, 1830. So the president was Andrew Jackson, and this became known as the nullification crisis. So what happened was the federal government enacted a tax. Okay, so the federal government was going to enact a tax here, and South Carolina, the state, said, no. We're not going to pay that tax. Forget it. And the reason we're not going to pay it is because we nullify it. So what they said was, anybody who lives in South Carolina, no problem. Don't worry. You don't have to pay the tax because South Carolina has nullified that tax inside South Carolina. So this was, nullification. So this was certainly not welcomed back in Washington at the federal level, and certainly not welcomed by the president, Andrew Jackson. So what happened here was Congress actually, got involved here, and this started, building more and more, and it was looking like it was going to lead to conflict. So Congress even passed a law authorizing the federal army to march on South Carolina. And the president, Jackson, he said, I'm going to march the federal army into South Carolina, and I'm going to take the first nullifier I see and hang them from the nearest tree. That's what a president said. President Jackson, pretty amazing. So this is heading towards a war here of America versus South Carolina. I mean, amazing. So what ended up happening was they ended up modifying the tax law a little bit, tweaking it. South Carolina agreed to pay the tax then, so they both had sort of a face-saving, measure here. They could both say that they saved face and that they won, and conflict was averted here. But nonetheless, that was an instance of a state bringing up nullification. Another instance, which is incredible, was the 19th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment is what gave women the right to vote. This was in 1920. It's actually incredible to think that it was only 1920 when women got the right to vote. I mean, that is not very long ago. It's astonishing to think that all the way up to this nation's history, all the way through 1920, women did not have the right to vote. That is amazing. So 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution is passed. Women all across the nation have the right to vote. Hooray! But not everybody liked that idea, including the state of Maryland. So the state of Maryland says, no. We don't like this idea of women voting, so we are going to nullify that. We're going to nullify the 19th Amendment, so women cannot vote in the state of Maryland. This is what Maryland argued. This is only in 1921. I mean, it's not very long ago. It's amazing to think, right? So that argument did not prevail, thankfully. So women had the right to vote in Maryland, but nonetheless, it just shows these states were trying to, raise this argument of nullification. And again, we saw it again in the Supreme Court case of the Brown versus Board of Education, which was 1954. So this was the case that integrated the schools. So this is the case that said black children have the right to attend white schools. Now, some southern states did not agree with that, and they said that they were not going to integrate their schools based, again, on nullification. So again, it's amazing. 1954, not very long ago, these states were arguing this concept of nullification. Amazing. So, and today, even in present day, you see it. And the context that it often arises in present day is under federal regulation, like when the federal government is going to regulate something. And it's usually raised by these sort of fringe, sort of extreme groups. So an example is like the Environmental Protection Agency. When the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, comes out with like a new regulation on land or something, some of these fringe groups will say, we are not going to follow that rule. We can nullify that rule because it's our state's rights to do that. And you see it also like when the federal government regulates guns or regulates marijuana. Some of these sort of extreme groups come out and say, we're not going to follow that. We're going to nullify that. So you see it around to this day. Now, the Supreme Court has addressed this issue, and the Supreme Court has struck that down. The Supreme Court has said, no. Nullification is unconstitutional. Okay, states do not have the right to nullify a federal law. No. That's not the way the system works. So the Supreme Court has been clear on that. But nonetheless, this nullification issue is still around. It's amazing. It's also amazing to think that nullification was created by some of our founding fathers, by Jefferson and Madison. I mean, these were the guys who created this country. These were the guys that created the federal system and the Constitution, right? And to think that they also created this idea of state nullification that undermines this whole federal system. It's amazing to think. But that is what they did. That is what they were arguing. So, Jefferson and Madison here were, arguing this nullification. So it seems like, we might think today that, well, wait a minute, this nullification is this, crazy, extreme idea. Maybe Jefferson himself was extreme and sort of a wacko, right? Because as you see throughout history, seemingly all the times that nullification has been raised, it was kind of by extreme wacko groups. So if Jefferson was raising it, maybe Jefferson also was a wacko himself. Maybe he was this extreme guy. And there is certainly, support for that. But on the other hand, think about it from Jefferson's perspective. Jefferson was the guy who drafted the Declaration of Independence for this nation, right? He was in favor of, this nation breaking away from England, right? So if you think about that, think about the Act of America, that when America was created, that was a nullification in and of itself and a secession, right? So that was England trying to impose a tax on America, and America saying, no, we're not going to pay that tax. Instead, we're going to nullify that law, and we are going to secede and form our own nation in America. So when you think about it, it's the very same issue, taxation. What's the difference? What's the difference when America secedes from England? And when America secedes from England, everyone goes, yay, America, free country, creating a free country. It's a wonderful thing. But what's the difference? Why can't South Carolina secede from America, from the federal government? When the federal government tries to impose a tax on South Carolina, why can't South Carolina say, I'm not going to pay that tax, I nullify that law, and I secede and create my own country? Right? It seems very similar. So when you look at it from Jefferson's perspective, from this perspective, this makes some sense, right? And this is what Jefferson wrote into the Declaration of Independence. He wrote that when a nation is under tyrannical laws, so when the government starts to impose tyrannical laws on the people have the right to throw off that tyrannical government and form their own government. Okay, so that is nullification and secession. So from that perspective, that's how this country was founded. It doesn't really seem so wacky. Okay, so what it highlights is the contradiction, the inherent contradiction between having a strong federal government and having freedom. Right? And this is one of the central contradictions of our entire country and what our country was founded upon. This goes back to the essential question of trying to strike the balance between having a federal government that has laws and order and enables us to come together and act as a union, while at the same time trying to preserve our individual liberties. So this makes some sense why Jefferson was in favor of this nullification. So these arguments are raging here back at the time. The Alien and Sedition Acts, people don't like those laws, and journalists are being thrown in jail. And also the idea of nullification, maybe states could nullify those acts. All this is going on, but it was all under the rubric of the potential war with France. So what happens? Well, what happens was, so the country is sort of banging the drum for war against France. Right? So the Federalists are sort of fomenting war. Washington and Hamilton are building up the federal army to prepare for an attack by France. Right? So the country is kind of under this, idea that they're going to go to war. And this was actually popular, that, people in the country wanted to go to war against France to teach France a lesson that they shouldn't be attacking our ships. But John Adams in the presidency, he is just not comfortable here going to war. He's got big concerns. So one of his concerns is, just that war is going to be this devastating thing on the country, because war is a terrible thing. So that's one concern. But also John Adams is thinking, what? We might not win that war. Right? France might win the war. So Adams has these, grave concerns. Now, this is getting to the end of the Adams administration here, the end of Adams's first term here, and Adams knows he wants to run for president again. So this has a political dynamic to it also. So there was a risk that, by Adams backing away from war, that would have a political cost. That would be detrimental to Adams, because the people were ready to go to war against France. So there was a political dynamic here too. So what does Adams do? Well, the country is sort of, feels like the country is sort of drifting towards war here. But at the last minute, Adams enters into a treaty with France. Okay, the treaty resolves the issue and it averts war. Okay, now this might seem like a great thing, but the Federalists actually, this was a problem, right? Because the Federalists wanted to go to war with France, and a lot of people in the country wanted to go to war with France. So Adams knew that this was potentially a political cost to him, that this might be unpopular, that he would resolve this through a peaceful treaty with France. So, but this is what he does. So this was basically the same resolution that America did with England, right? When England was attacking the American ships, they enter into a treaty, and this is what Adams is able to do with France as well. They enter into a treaty to resolve the issue. So Adams knows that this might be, it might have a political cost for him, that it might not be popular. But nonetheless, it's another instance of Adams putting the interests of the nation ahead of his own personal political interests, which is pretty good. So today, this is widely regarded by scholars and historians as an achievement for John Adams, that John Adams was able to avert war with France. And this act, this treaty here, is now regarded widely as being one of the greatest achievements of the presidency of John Adams.